So those who followed my channel for all these years will know that I am no fan of monetization systems in video games, microtransactions, loot boxes, battle passes, the different editions, you name it. You know, they try to implement every single one of them in video games, and they serve no good purpose other than to make companies more money. They ruin game design, and they essentially target the most vulnerable crowds, whether it's people who are susceptible to that kind of the serotonin that leads them to recurrently spend without really thinking about it, or, children. And the children part in particular is one area where I just can't believe how far the games industry has been able to take monetization. Like the kinds of games that feature the kinds of monetizations that would make casinos blush is insane. And currently, under the limelight is a game going by the name StarStable. You can see right here, it looks innocent enough. It's all about essentially accruing horses and going on adventures with them. You can see right here, just from the visual aesthetic, it is definitely targeted at children. And then beyond that, if you look at the game's rating, E for everyone, you would assume that this game is meant for kids and that there is no harm in kids playing this title. Same if you go to the Apple App Store, you'll find that the game is targeted at age rating 9+ due to infrequent/mild horror/fear themes and infrequent/mild cartoon or fantasy violence. But nowhere here does it say that there are elements that might lead to monetization indulgences that may be unhealthy for children. But this is a game that indeed does feature heavy monetization in the form of star coins, which is the premium currency of this game. It features memberships that are required for you to be able to level up past a certain point and more. And so this is a game that kind of has kickstarted a movement within the European Union and its commission that protects consumers to kind of hunker down and to kind of put a plug on this kind of stuff, on these kinds of practices. So right here we have a post published by the European Commission, published on March 20th, 2025. The headline speaks for itself. Commission and national authorities take action to protect children from harmful practices in video games. And this is not the first time we've seen, especially Europe, kind of try to tackle anti-consumer gaming practices. Back when loot boxes was a major topic of conversation, especially when Star Wars Battlefront 2 kind of pissed everyone off, essentially, and brought the practice of loot boxes to the spotlight, we got companies like Belgium and the UK and Japan, among others, who decided to take measures to kind of put in regulations and guidelines that would ensure that companies can't just run amok with that practice. But there are other microtransactions practices that are still very much being taken advantage of by companies. And with something like StarStable, that is just so very clearly meant to specifically appeal to a younger crowd, it having those kinds of microtransactions elements and it all being done in a shady way has raised the attention of the European Commission. And the hope is that as these guidelines get established, it'll be something that will resonate enough in terms of it being applied across the entirety of Europe and across major markets that companies will be forced to remove these elements. And so this is what the European Commission had to say on this front. Coordinated by the European Commission, the Consumer Protection Cooperation Network has launched an enforcement action against StarStable Entertainment AB to ensure a safer, more transparent experience for players of the StarStable online game. In addition, the CPC network is presenting today key principles to help the gaming industry comply with the European Union's consumer protection rules related to in-game virtual currencies. So it's not just about scrutinizing StarStable, the game, and StarStable Entertainment, the company. It's about evaluating that and then trying to apply that to kind of gaming regulations across the board. Concern surrounding StarStable in particular was raised by the Swedish Consumers Association, and the CPC, evaluating the game and its practices, have identified a number of practices that violate European consumer protection legislation and that could be particularly harmful to children, such as, and these are some of the bullet points that highlight the practices that not just StarStable, but a lot of mobile games and games targeted at children engage in: direct appeals to children in the advertisements, urging them to buy or persuade adults to buy for them in-game currency or items. That's a big no-no in Europe. And just in general, advertising to children is a practice that is heavily frowned upon kind of worldwide. I mean, even YouTube has guidelines when it comes to advertising directly to children, and those are enforced quite heavily. The use of pressuring techniques such as purchase through time-limited practices to unduly influence children to purchase in-game virtual currency or in-game content. This is a practice that we can see applied to StarStable. If we look right here at their website and scroll down to this segment right here, highlighting some Star Rider memberships, you can see right here that these offers expire on March 31st. And this is a game that features a lot of that stuff where if you don't get this by a certain day, then it will go away and you'll miss on it forever. And that gives people that sense of FOMO, that gives them that kind of need and desire to make these purchases before the game that they've already invested so much time and money and like essentially emotional attachment into fully goes away forever, and they never get to kind of partake in that content. And so it's pretty scummy stuff. Even their premium currency, Star Coins, have a time limit. It has a notice here that says that these offers expire on March 31st. And not only is it about the premium currency, but some of the extra items that you might get from that. And so, yeah, this is far from ideal and certainly not something that should be included in a video game that is strictly and very focused on appealing to children. The bullet points continue here when it comes to practices that violate European consumer protection legislation. A lack of clear and transparent information adapted to children about buying and using in-game virtual currency, leading consumers to spend more than they intend to. That's a big part of how microtransactions infused games make so much money, is essentially leading consumers astray by not giving them all the information, by keeping them ignorant about just how much these expenditures add up to, trying to kind of obfuscate the real cost of things with virtual currencies instead of presenting real dollar values and stuff like that. And then finally, failure by the company to ensure that the influencers promoting their products clearly disclose commercial content and do not unduly influence children with their marketing techniques. That's especially scummy. So influencers will often get briefs in terms of what's allowed and what isn't allowed when they get sponsored and when they have ads and spots in the middle of their videos, or if they make entire videos that are sponsored. There will be certain guidelines if they're getting paid for that. And, when they take that on and when they're told that you are not allowed to talk about the inclusion of monetization and microtransactions elements in a game that targets children, I mean, that's about as underhanded as marketing for a game can get, especially when it is targeted at children, when it does go children with visuals that look innocent enough, with horses and, all of this magical stuff that then ultimately amounts to, hey, whoopsie poopsie, you got to level 5, but if you want to proceed onwards, you have to pay us. They give them just enough leeway to play enough of the game to get them hooked, and then they put up a brick wall where they say if you want to bring that brick wall down to allow you to play the game further and progress at a pace where the game's still fun as you remember it being in those initial hours, then you have to pay us. And that's how you manipulate children. And so with all these violations being discovered, StarStable Entertainment has now 1 month to provide a written response addressing the issues. The CPC network emphasizes the need for video games and their commercial practices to be adapted to children and to not exploit their vulnerabilities. So while this specific situation is being directed at StarStable Entertainment, this is just a general request and a general demand from the CPC that video games that are targeted for children do not exploit their vulnerabilities, as it says right here. And so many games right now do it. And I mean, you look at games that are far bigger IPs like Pokemon Go and the Mario Kart mobile game that features microtransactions and whatnot, and the way they implement those microtransactions. And Nintendo's all about being, family friendly, but when it comes to their mobile ventures, they completely discard their stances and ideals. The kind of negative impact that can have, the kind of harm that can do is substantial. And so it's great to see any kind of regulation happening, any kind of talks happening, especially by the European Commission, who are very serious about consumer protection. And it's great to see that they're establishing these key principles when it comes to how monetization, especially in games targeting children, should be handled. So It reads right here that the CPC network, coordinated by the European Commission, is publishing a set of guidelines today to promote transparency and fairness in the online gaming industry's use of virtual currencies. The key principles outline the minimum requirements for the purchase and use of virtual currencies, including clear and transparent pricing and pre-contractual information. Transparency is one area where monetization in video games is completely lacking, because if companies actually disclosed all of the information that consumers would want when it comes to these monetization systems, they'd be less incentivized to actually spend money on that stuff. Then this continues: avoiding practices hiding the costs of in-game digital content and services, as well as practices forcing consumers to purchase virtual currency. Stuff like level gating stuff or slowing the game down dramatically after giving them kind of a grace period of a few hours of gameplay, and putting up that brick wall once they've had enough of a taste of the game where they're hooked. Manipulate them into an emotionally vulnerable position so that they'll make impulsive decisions to keep spending on this game that has hooked them from those initial hours where they got this grace period, where they got all this leeway. Then we have respect of consumers' right of withdrawal. This is a big one right here. A lot of microtransactions purchases are deemed to be one and done, completely final. There's no leeway or no pathway towards refunds, or, if you make accidental purchases, if your kid accidentally purchased a bunch of microtransactions without realizing that they're spending real currency, which is something that has happened a lot. It has been reported on in the news. FIFA in particular, there's this kid who wanted to get Lionel Messi in FIFA and didn't realize that their parents' credit cards and debit cards were hooked to the game, and so they kept making loot box purchases to try to get Lionel Messi in those card packs and whatnot. And so, parents not having leeway to withdraw their purchases in those situations, or just customers who are engaging with these games not having any semblance of kind of refund policies or being able to get that money back and undo the damage. That is incredibly scummy, and that's something that the European Commission is not having with these new guidelines. And then finally, respecting consumer vulnerabilities, in particular when it comes to children. That's a broader bullet point that basically says if your game is being made for children, maybe don't design it in such a way where the sole purpose of it is ultimately to extract as much money as possible from the target audience. Include the proper safeguards, and include the proper warnings so that parents are aware. Include the proper restrictions to ensure that children aren't able to spend en masse on games like these. Except what games are doing is the complete opposite. They're making games that do appeal to children, that children might want to download, and then they are purposely designing these games to prey on children's wanton wants and needs. And then beyond that, every aspect of the game's user interface is designed so that, those buttons that say buy more are appealing. They're easily accessible. It's very easy for children to find the purchase buttons, and they do that on purpose so that the en masse spending isn't restricted or hampered in any way, shape, or form, to make that process as easy and as, one press of a button as possible. And so the way you respect consumer vulnerabilities is if you make a game that is supposed to be kids friendly, then, just don't include any kind of monetization system whatsoever, or make it difficult for children to spend money on the games, require parents to be present and input their credit card information every single time, instead of it being something that can happen automatically, that children can, push a button over and over and over again for them to be able to make continuous purchases. Make it something that is very restricted, and have the appropriate warnings in the games themselves when it comes to the ratings of games. The fact that StarStable is E for everyone is ridiculous. The fact that FIFA is E for everyone, despite it being a game that includes blatant gambling, is, the complete opposite of respecting consumer vulnerabilities, in particular when it comes to children. They just don't include anything that informs customers that there are some dangerous elements here with the way monetization works, because presenting a notion that monetization in video games are dangerous means that people have awareness that these games maybe aren't something that they should purchase. Game companies make zero attempt to include any kind of barrier of entry when it comes to children, when it comes to games that children will find attractive, and they're completely doing this on purpose because they understand how monetizable children are. And it's just really disgusting to think about. And so the fact that the European Commission is stepping in and they're still fighting that good fight is just great to see. The fact that even in 2025 there's awareness of this is good, because honestly, for so many years it felt like the conversation has kind of died down. but it seems like it's kind of picking back up. And hopefully this means that legislations will be enacted to make all of this stricter, to ensure that companies face greater consequences if they violate the rules, as they continue to try to attempt kind of like poking and prodding at what they can get away with. And the hope is that by the time those regulations are enacted and are enforced in the strictest of manners, where game companies will ultimately feel like it's a liability to include monetization systems like these, especially in games that target children, they'll stop doing it altogether because it poses too great a risk, because it might lead them to being fined and kind of essentially being deemed as violators of the law. And so that's the goal, to make this a universal thing rather than something that is relegated strictly to specific markets. It's hopefully something that will catch on, and all markets will enact these kinds of regulations that are very reasonable and very simple. And, anyone with any semblance of morals would have all of these guidelines in mind, but because laws haven't caught up yet, and because they're able to get away with it, they just will try to get away with it. They'll try to exploit every ounce of these shady monetization practices that they can get away with until they no longer can. And so the sooner these regulations can be enforced and enacted and presented and be encouraged the rest of the world to follow suit with, the better. But, this will ultimately take time because that's just the nature of laws and regulations. But for now, I'd love to hear what your thoughts and opinions are on the European Commission's latest post and update in regards to harmful practices in video games that target children. And, we'll see how all of this pans out in the long run. In the meantime, though, share your thoughts on all of this in the comments below. And to be further updated on all things gaming news, reviews, and discussions, stay tuned right here on Young Yeah. I'll see you guys next time. Young out.